All right, well, thank you, Dr. Lopez, for the invitation. I'm very happy to talk about Euripides, who's one of my very favorite artists of any kind, of any time. Euripides, you have a handout which has a lot of stuff on it. I'll cover a lot of it, but I hope you'll also read in your study some of the things if they interest you. Euripides, an Athenian poet who wrote tragedies. You see his dates there on the handout, lived most of the 5th century BC. He competed in the tragedy contests in Athens at the city Dionysia from the year 441. He won 4 times. Askulus won 13 times, Sophocles won 18 times. Euripides, by that standard, was not as successful as they. Yet at the same time, he was vastly the most popular in Athens, vastly the most popular in Hellenistic culture after, and the most influential on drama of the future. He wrote about 92 plays. We have 19, which is a lot more than the 7 of the other, the standard number of the other tragedians. By accident, by happy accident, one volume of an edition of Euripides' plays in alphabetical order survived. So we have plays, extra plays, that begin with the letters epsilon, iota, and kappa. So the only surviving satyr play that we have is the Cyclops, beginning with kappa. From 408, the dates of the plays are on the handout. So you're aware of what a satyr play is. In the contest of Athens, tragedies were presented in groups of 3 and then groups of 4, followed by a play in which the chorus was composed of satyrs and made an ironic or funny kind of commentary on the themes of the trilogy, perhaps. So our one example of this genre survived accidentally, the Cyclops of Euripides. Also surviving is Alcestis, another satyr play, although performed in the 4th place of a tetralogy, but another innovation, a satyr play without satyrs. It's a play about a woman who gives her life in exchange for her husband. By Athenian standards, the ideal wife. Also, again, by accident, these plays beginning with iota and epsilon, tragedies that end with a happy ending, they end with an escape that challenge you to understand what the genre of tragedy is, or ask you to think about the innovations that Euripides brought to tragedy. Iphigenia in Tauris, Helen, and Ion, perhaps themselves influenced by the pattern of satyr play. Anyway, the Cyclops ends with an escape. Euripides, as I said, is the most popular of the playwrights for the accessibility of his language, simpler language than the other ones. He's a realistic choice if you want to read, if you want to start reading Greek poetry. It's a realistic choice as a first author to read. Popular for the everyday realism of his characters and situations. Popular for his sensational subject matter. I mean, trashy even, his detractors would say, but just horrific things happen in his tragedies. And then also, he was central to Hellenistic education. Later on, he was a school author in the way in which Askulus and Sophocles were not, even if, as I say, he was less successful with the judges of the tragedy contest in Athens. He's the most pathetic, the most tear-jerking, the most perverse, the most funny, and the most critical questioning, of the tragedians, all of which, I love Euripides for. And as I said, he's most influential for the future. A new genre to come is so-called new comedy. Perhaps you'll study it. The drama of Menander, Plautus, and Terence in Latin. Euripides, the tragedian, is a great influence on a new kind of comedy about everyday life and the grumpy father, the nosy neighbor, all of that, the bratty children, all of that, a new genre of comedy very influenced by Euripides. All right, some ancient judgments of Euripides on your handout. From Aristotle's Poetics, whether or not Sophocles really said this, Aristotle makes this remark of Sophocles famous. Sophocles said that he portrayed people as they ought to be, and Euripides portrayed them as they are. So yes, Aristotle recognizing the realism that Euripides tried to bring to tragedy. Another judgment from the Poetics. Euripides is clearly the most tragic of the poets. Tragikotatos ton poieton. It isn't necessarily absolutely clear what Aristotle meant by this, but it's most generally understood what is certainly true about Euripides, and that is, again, he's the most tear-jerking, having the most horrendous and pathetic situations in his tragedy. And Aristotle is recognizing this. Women being led into slavery, at the end of a war, mothers seeing their daughters violated and brutalized and led into slavery. Mothers tearing apart their children, in various contexts, as we'll talk about. Just terrible situations. And that is perhaps, side by side with these tragic comedies that have happy endings. Aristotle recognizing that. Yes, one important formative influence on Euripides' career was the Peloponnesian War that was going on as Euripides was having his career. You may have or will read about and study the Peloponnesian War, but within the Greek context, a world war, a war of the whole Greek world from 431 to 404. Two famous plays that deal with war, Hecuba and the Trojan Women. Euripides in plays like this used the Trojan War, as an image for the contemporary war that he was living through, all of Athens was living through and fighting. And this is the technique of tragedy. As you've gathered, you use Bronze Age myth to talk about and think about contemporary politics, contemporary events. So one of the ways in which Euripides is the most tragic of the tragic poets is showing people destroyed by war, which is an experience that his fellow citizens in Athens were having. Another important formative influence on Euripides' career is the Sophistic Movement. And again, I hope you read about this and study this at some point. But very briefly, in the mid and late 5th century, there was an intellectual movement to study language and techniques of persuasion. That is rhetoric. And together with that, the technical study of language and rhetoric, a movement to assess critically, to critically analyze traditional moral and theological beliefs. So the Sophistic Movement was happening around Euripides. Euripides was a proponent in a certain way of the Sophistic Movement. His drama was deeply influenced, the way people talk, deeply influenced by the Sophists. Now, of course, in modern English, sophist is a dirty word. And of course, Plato stigmatizes sophists because of their claim that language creates reality. Now, that is not a claim that we as Christians, can validate. But and Plato and Aristotle, were critiquing, coming out of and critiquing the Sophistic Movement. But I would say to you all, don't undervalue the Sophistic Movement. which gave us the disciplines of grammar. The grammatical terms we use were devised by the Sophists. If you love grammar, you have to appreciate the Sophists, as we all do. If you love rhetoric, the Sophists were sort of the first scientists of rhetoric in our tradition. So, and of course, the disciplines of linguistics and the natural sciences are to this day valid intellectual disciplines that go back to the Sophists. So don't stigmatize the Sophists in a simple way. Anyway, Euripides shows in all of his drama the techniques of the Sophists. The death of Euripides in 406 was, in the city, a national event, a terrible event, like the death of, I don't know, Michael Jackson or something, or the death of, Tim McCarver, whose funeral is in Memphis, Tennessee today, this afternoon. The next year, Aristophanes did a comedy where Euripides and Askulus in the underworld are characters. Okay, this comedy's The Frogs. Aristophanes and his comedy, interestingly, is a brilliant literary critic. I mean, literary criticism in a certain way emerges from comedy, the ability to do parody. Anyway, that's a whole interesting topic for another time. But in Aristophanes' Frogs, Euripides is a character and gives this little speech about his own dramaturgy. Now, I emphasize again, this is Euripides as a character in a comedy. But Aristophanes is very perceptive when he has Euripides say these things. I taught these people how to speak. All right, he has speeches in his drama that use rhetorical techniques. I taught these people the use of subtle rules and squared off words. Okay, to think, to see, to understand, to twist, to love, to use technique, to suspect the worst, to overanalyze everything. All right, Euripides loves to find dark motives and analyze motives in his drama, and this is very perceptive. Bringing in domestic matters, oikeia pragmata. Aristophanes is recognizing, the daily life aspect, the realism of Euripidean tragedy. Bringing in domestic matters that we're used to and understand, about which I could defend myself when questioned. The verb there is from the noun elenchus. Do you know that Greek word elenchus? It means conversation back and forth, cross-examination, and defense. This is an important technique, of course, in Plato. Elenchus, conversation, where you examine one another's opinions. Well, he's saying, I am capable of elenchus. I'm capable of answering questions about my art. I have a self-conscious awareness of what I do. For these people are knowledgeable and could have examined me about my art. Okay? I didn't toss off boasts, distracting them from thinking, and I didn't scare them. Right? Askulus, for example, famous, who I love in different ways, equally as much, I must say, but Askulus, famous for these monsters, in his tragedy, and his monstrous verse, really complicated, difficult Greek, and his incantatory, his just flamboyant, over-the-top musical effects. Euripides didn't do that, he says. I didn't try to overwhelm you. I didn't try to stun you. I tried to work with your critical abilities when I was doing my tragedy. Aristophanes, very perceptive in The Frogs about Askulus and Euripides. Euripides, who had just died the year before. Well, as I say, the people of Athens were passionate for Euripides. A little story that really brings this across, this is a brief summary of it, from Plutarch's work, the Nicias. Plutarch says there that Greek colonists in Sicily loved Euripides. Okay, that's interesting in itself, you know, an idea in colonization. You know, sometimes the colonists, you know, are extremely avid for the culture of their mother country. Anyway, in Sicily, the Greek colonists were always eager to hear people who knew Euripides' songs and speeches. Well, anyway, one of the climactic events of the Peloponnesian War was Athens invaded Sicily with a huge force and were defeated in 413. The Sicilian expedition against Sicily ended in disaster for the Athenians. There were some 7,000 prisoners of war in Sicily, many of whom died in the prison camp and many of whom were sold into slavery. But Plutarch says that some of those Athenians were able to redeem themselves from slavery by being able to recite passages of Euripides and sing Euripides songs to people in Sicily and Syracuse. And when they were released and sent home, they thanked Euripides for saving their lives. You know, that story is interesting in many ways. I mean, of course, how much these people loved Euripides, but also in this culture, you know, before you have, well, video cameras and things and the internet and podcasts or whatever, how much they could memorize, okay, and retain and remember in oral culture and transmit. All right, well, I said Euripides was important in Hellenistic education, and here's a nice example of that works with our appreciation of the New Testament. St. Luke puts Euripides' play, The Bacchae, in the literary background of Acts of the Apostles that he imagines his Greek readers will get. Bacchae is one of these sensational, you know, extremely tragic plays. The god Dionysus, who is new, who is foreign, who's a newcomer to the pantheon, punishes the city of Thebes for rejecting him. The king Pentheus says you can't worship Dionysus. All right? But Pentheus's mother, Agave, does agree to worship Dionysus, who's the god of ecstasy, right? The god of getting drunk and running naked in the woods, you know, dissolving all human convention, you know, to celebrate, to have fun, to get away from the drag of everyday life. All right, so she goes out, gets drunk, runs naked in the woods. You know, she's tearing apart wild animals and eating them raw. But she's so drunk she doesn't understand that it's not actually a wild animal she's tearing apart. It's her son, Pentheus. And then she comes back to the city with his head on a stake and then sobers up and realizes what she's done. Well, you know, this is a kind of shock. It's an important play to read, right? Among other things, Euripides is giving a theology, is giving a play about the God for whom tragedy is composed, all right? The tragedies of the tragic contests were held to honor Dionysus, the festival of Dionysus. So who is Dionysus? Well, the Bacchae, you know, is one one play that tells you who Dionysus is. Well, one theme of the Bacchae, of course, is it is wrong, it is dangerous to reject a new religious authority. You know, it's dangerous to reject a new God, so to speak. Well, Luke seems to, put that in the background as one little, spice to Acts of the Apostles. God says the same thing to Paul that Dionysus says to Pentheus, this Greek proverb. Do not kick against the goads, which means do not resist divine authority. The citations are there on the handout. But God says to Paul what Dionysus says to Pentheus. Another allusion, Gamaliel in Acts of the Apostles and Dionysus both say, do not be a god fighter, a theomakos, which is something of a rare word. And so, there does seem to be an echo there. Theomakoi, the don't be theomakoi. And Pentheus objects to the hos theomake, the one who was a god fighter. And third, Peter and Dionysus both escape from prison. A story pattern that's similar. So again, the Bacchae of Euripides, I summarized the plot, and I do invite you to read it. But one interpretation of the Bacchae that you can have is, well, Dionysus is bad, Dionysus is dangerous. We actually had here at Cheshire a few years ago a very conservative Protestant minister, evangelical, who's a classics professor at Baylor, and he said to us, the message of the Bacchae is, don't do drugs, and beware of immigrants. Immigrants are bad. I'm being too simplistic, but I said to him when he was here, yes, I mean that's one. I'm not telling you, to do drugs, and I'm not. Immigrants. I love immigrants, but anyway. What Luke found in the Bacchae, for the readers of Acts of the Apostles is, don't resist divine authority. That's part of the Bacchae too. Resistance to a new god is dangerous and wrong. So this is characteristic of Euripides, right? To give you the horrendous nature of, just the overwhelming nature of Dionysus, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge what Dionysus is and balance. Well, anyway, a poet in Byzantine Greece in the 12th century AD rearranged some verses of Euripides' Bacchae into a play about the Passion of Jesus, called in Latin the Christus Patiens. That poet also recognized, the potential Christian, understanding of the Bacchae. So anyway, Bacchae, characteristically complex and interesting and challenging, to think about it. All right, I've mentioned so far a number of tragedies briefly, summarized them briefly. Let me talk about two of them in a little greater detail, although not much. I want to emphasize two tragedies, and again invite you to read them if you have time. One, Euripides' Electra, and another, Euripides' Medea. Electra is interesting to read because the three dramatists, the three major dramatists, Askulus, Sophocles, and Electra, all wrote plays about Electra, and they all survive. So they make a really nice comparison. Euripides wrote Electra. Askulus wrote the Libation Bearers, the Koephoroi, the middle play of the Oresteia from roughly 42 years before. And Sophocles wrote an Electra. It's a classic problem, whose came first and whose came second. And there isn't enough evidence to say, but they're right around the same time. One was a response to the other. Sophocles wrote an Electra. The story of Electra and Orestes, right, is a story of a moral dilemma. The mother of Orestes and Electra, Clytemnestra, kills their father Agamemnon, right, when he comes back from the Trojan War. So their mother killed their father, and there are now competing moral obligations. Orestes is morally obliged to avenge the death of his father, but he's morally obliged not to kill his mother. All right, so if your mother kills your father, what do? It's a dilemma. All right, for Askulus, who was a Democrat who supported with Pericles the expansion of the democratic constitution of Athens, in the Oresteia dramatizes that democratic progress brings the state beyond primitive vengeance justice with the institution of trials by jury for murder. So the horrendous moral dilemma here is solved by democracy, by trial by jury. And the Furies, who were about to punish Orestes for killing his mother, are now integrated into the state as a source of prosperity. I don't know if you've had a chance to think about or read the Oresteia, but it's an important thing to read. For Sophocles, now I may be unfair to Sophocles, but for Sophocles, the myth, the treatment is more conservative, coming to a somewhat more comforting conclusion. One of us was talking about this, and you can disagree, we can discuss it further, but if the vengeance takes place, it's a positive thing. We'd have less, villains if we were stricter on people who misbehave, particularly women who misbehave. Well, Euripides' play, the Electra, as is characteristic of Euripides, is skeptical and disturbing. Orestes obeys Apollo, the oracle at Delphi, who says it is right to kill your mother to avenge your father. And that's what Orestes relied on in the Oresteia, in the Coephae and the Eumenides. But it's revealed at the end of Euripides' Electra that Apollo was wrong. Apollo was tricking you. Apollo was lying. All right? And so at the end of Euripides' Electra, you have this action of vengeance has frustrated and depressed everyone. The reason, it does is because you undertook this traditional, moral action, this act of traditional heroism, but without examining it carefully, and there is no easy solution to it. And again, so characteristic of Euripides to be examining that problem in a different way. Do you know the term recognition scene? A scene of anagnoresis there in the handout. One characteristic scene in tragedy, also in comedy, by the way. This is one influence of comedy that Euripides gives, from this sort of, that tragedy in general gives from this sort of scene. Suppose you knew each other as children. How do you recognize each other later in life? How do you validate your identity anyway, without a passport or a birth certificate? How do people validate their identity? So one important scene in the story of Electra and Orestes is, how do they recognize each other? They haven't seen each other since they were children. On the last page of the handout, I put this scene, the two scenes kind of side by side, and talk about it briefly, and maybe you'll read it for yourself and with a little more detail. In Askulus libation bearers, Electra recognizes Orestes with three tokens. A piece of hair that he's left at the tomb, a footprint that he left in the dirt, and a little scrap of his clothing, a piece of weaving. Electra says this must be Orestes. In Askulus, what is emphasized here in the recognition is the sort of emotional union, the appropriate union of this brother and sister, this new integration. This is a piece of progress, that they find their relationship, they find who they are, and they are going to go forward with the vengeance and kill their mother, and then they will go forward and be absolved of the crime in Athens in a trial by jury. Well, Euripides' Electra repeats this scene, and he does a parody of it. He makes fun of it. Electra says to the old man who's urging her to take in this token, "Don't be stupid," right? You can't judge anyone's identity with a lock of hair, right? It doesn't work. that, you can't judge anyone, by their footstep. You're telling me that, a footstep in the sand is going to identify my brother? Don't be absurd. And finally, you can't judge someone by a piece of clothing. How could he still be wearing the same clothes he wore as a child unless his clothes grew with them? All right? Askulus's tokens are absurd, Euripides says in this scene. So how then does Electra recognize Orestes? Well, by a scar, all right? The scar on his eyebrow from a fall long ago when chasing a fawn with you in your father's palace. Okay, well, that's an allusion, of course, to Odysseus's recognition in the Odyssey. And yet, it's a parody even of that. Odysseus got his scar in a boar hunt. Orestes got his scar chasing a deer, when they were children. So, what is it? This scene is truly funny. This is hilarious. One great innovation in Euripides' tragedy is you can have laughter in tragedy, without ruining the effect. This is really bitter, this is really, bitter parody. But so it's funny, but it's not just perverse and funny, it's in keeping with the goals of his drama. It's a critical assessment of the literary tradition. It's a piece of literary criticism of Askulus. It's a piece of realism. How realistically do we recognize one another, in this world? And ultimately, it's about, the false values of an unexamined heroism. Electra says, oh, my brother wouldn't have come here in secret. He'd come in as a bold avenger. Well, the thing about Orestes has received a sophistic education. Orestes is a little bit, hesitant about killing his mother. He's like examining it and saying, it's not so obvious, that's what I should do. He does it in a begrudging way because Apollo said so, but then he's kind of tricked because Apollo, wasn't telling him the right thing. I want to share with you one kind of brilliant characteristic moment from Euripides' Electra that is just utterly untranslatable. As I just said, Orestes is a hero, but he's been, compromised in a way, or educated, or he's been, refined by a sophistic education. He's not sure that he really does want to kill his mother. He says this at one point. En esti doiktos amateiai men udamu sopoisi dandron, kaigar udas demion gnomen anenai tos sopois lian sopein. Okay, there is never pity, oiktos, in ignorance. Okay, but only in the sophoi among men. What does sophos mean? Well, don't say wise. All right, or in a way it means wise. Okay. But it also means many other things. It means skillful. And in this context, of the year, or whatever, 416, it means educated, trained, sophisticated, educated by sophists, rhetorically trained, able to see both sides of an issue. So he's saying there is only pity in people who have sufficient intellectual ability to recognize it. And it is not without penalty that the sophoi have to sophe an understanding. You always get punished if you see both sides of an issue. Some people have thought, this is something Euripides learned from experience. It may well be. It's not something you can ever prove. But here's the point, and this is a brilliant little moment. Euripides' Electra presents Orestes as a trained sophist who thinks critically about his tradition. And the play asks, how does the ability to see both sides of an issue make it harder to take decisive heroic action, right? If you're too educated, if you're too analytical, does that prevent you from acting? That's the question the play poses. In Euripides' Electra, empathy is an intellectual virtue. I mean, for the most tragic of poets, pity is not just an emotional virtue, it's an intellectual virtue. And I have a little passage from Edith Stein here from On the Problem of Empathy. I'll just read it for yourself and think further. It's amazing how Euripides, stands kind of at the beginning of a thought that was so important to St. Edith Stein and to John Paul, that empathy is a philosophical value that's important. Let me then finally talk about Euripides' Medea. This is another sort of outrageous, shocking play, okay? Medea, the plot is this briefly. Medea assists the Argonaut Jason, the Golden Fleece, the expedition for the Golden Fleece. So Medea betrays her own father and fatherland to help Jason. They get the Golden Fleece, they marry, they swear an oath of allegiance, return to Corinth. Jason breaks his oath, divorces Medea. She avenges herself against this by killing their children. All right. So again, another just horrendous, kind of bizarre situation in a Euripides tragedy. This tragedy is reflecting a contemporary problem, a contemporary issue. There was a change in citizenship law in Athens in the year 451. The Pericles citizenship law of 451 restricted citizenship to children born of two Athenian citizen parents. So Medea is a foreigner. By this new law, her children Jason's children, can't be fully citizens. So there were women in the city of Athens at the time, who were in this position themselves. They had been divorced because their husband moved on to marry a citizen woman so that their children wouldn't be excluded from citizenship. Medea is all about injustices that women face in the city of Athens. On the handout is a little bit of her famous speech, which I won't, in the interest of time, read, but maybe you'll read this for yourself. She points out something that is true. In Athens, women did not have full legal rights. They did not have legal independence. They had no say in whom they were marrying. All women had a legal guardian, a kurios, a legal guardian who stood for them in arranging their marriage in any legal transaction, did not have independent legal status. Well, Medea gives a speech here, and she's pointing this out, that women are in a terrible position in Athens. She also points out the social convention in Athens of the two spheres. Men go out in public, women are scarcely allowed to go out in public. Men can have interesting lives outside the house, women are not allowed to. Finally, of this famous line, I will read this aloud. I would very much rather stand 3 times in the front of battle than bear one child. Right? The physical bravery, of giving birth is undervalued in Athens, in favor of the physical bravery required to fight in the army. Well, Euripides has Medea, making a very effective critique of legal injustice against women in the city of Athens. Euripides also vindicates her killing of her children by making her a goddess at the end of a play. Okay? Do you know the term, I didn't put it on the handout, do you know the term Deus Ex Machina? There's a convention in Greek tragedy, the Deus Ex Machina, the god from the machine being a crane. Lots of construction going on in Athens in the 5th century. The Acropolis buildings went up, the Agora buildings went up, lots of buildings going up. The crane, perhaps coming from that, is a piece of stage equipment. To suspend an actor in the air, okay, to show that they're a god, all right, to elevate them. It's also a technical term, the Deus Ex Machina. Aristotle doesn't like this. When a complicated plot, doesn't have a way of concluding, a god might suddenly appear, and set everything in order and without further ado. And Deus Ex Machina in modern English kind of means, well, so to speak, in modern understanding kind of means a sudden, unprepared for conclusion. Anyway, well, Medea is a Dea Ex Machina. She's there on the crane with her dead children, vindicated as a goddess, vindicated by her grandfather, the sun, Helios. Like a goddess, she announces a cult of her children in Corinth, which was a historical cult. There was a cult of Medea and her children in Athens. Well, all of this is strange, okay? Does it make cultural sense? What is Euripides asking us to think about? Euripides puts in play several things. First, remember, in Greek culture, marriage was not accompanied by vows, as in our culture, as in our sacramental culture particularly. Marriage in Greek culture was not solemnized by oaths. So Jason and Medea have an unusual bond. They have a bond like two cities would have, an alliance, a treaty that was made solemn by an oath. This goes beyond a marriage. So that's an interesting move. It's an interesting, innovation by Euripides. So if they're two nations swearing an oath, what happens when they become enemies? Right? An ethic in war, a traditional view of justice, a Greek view of justice, to harm your friends and to harm your enemies and benefit your friends. Benefit your friends, harm your enemies. Well, now if her children have now become her enemies, in a certain sense, it's ethical to kill them. They're like enemies on the battlefield. She says something, that Achilles might say, "Let no one think me trivial and weak, but fierce to my enemies and to my friends kind." Secondly, Medea complains, that there's no respect for oaths anymore. Jason took an oath, and by divorcing her, he breaks his oath. Well, there's a moral view in Hesiod, that didactic poet, that didactic epic poet, Hesiod in the Works and Days, says this: "Whoever deliberately lies in his witness and forswears himself, and so hurts justice and sins beyond repair, that man's generation is left obscure thereafter. If you break your oath, the Furies will come after you and destroy your children," basically. Well, that's literally what happens in Medea. What happens in Medea is something that you could parallel from Hesiod. But what's bizarre is, of course, that Medea is her own avenging fury. While we're on the subject, and while you're all reading in the Aeneid, Medea is important background to the fourth book of the Aeneid, where, of course, the famous story of Dido and Aeneas. By alluding to the right hand, Virgil puts Aeneas in the mythic pattern of Jason, who abandoned Medea, and complicates, that whole situation. I underlined it in Medea's speech there. Medea says, "Peu dexiacer e supole lambanu kai tonda gonaton." So that dexiacer, the right hand, is what Virgil alludes to when he has Dido say in the fourth book of the Aeneid, "Per ego has lacrimas dextramque tuam te." Okay. By your right hand, I'm alluding to the right hand. And I urge you all to think, this is subtle in Aeneid, and you can argue it both ways, but, it's easy to make a Christian allegory of the Aeneid, and say, Dido was this horrible woman, distracting, the young man from his vocation. But, it's easy to make that allegory. But, Aeneid, in the Aeneid of Virgil, he does put he of course validates Aeneas, leaving Dido. That has to happen for Rome to happen. But he's always insisting, what's the cost, of founding Rome? Well, the cost is a certain injustice against Dido that Aeneas commits. And one of the ways that Virgil communicates that is to allude to Medea in this way. It's disconcerting that Medea treats her children as Achilles treats his enemies on the battlefield. That's disconcerting, but there's a certain logic to it. It's disconcerting, Jason deserves an avenging fury, but it's disconcerting that Medea is that avenging fury. Anyway, altogether, Euripides in the Medea suggests empathy for violence by mothers against their children, when it's done out of an outrage for injustice they're suffering. And just to make you think more about that and perhaps the value of Euripides in the tradition, a little piece from John Paul's letter to women. We're just out of time, but read that. But John Paul, recognizing women's dignity has often been unacknowledged and their prerogatives misrepresented. John Paul said a number of sort of visionary and challenging things, didn't he, in his years? And he had less interest in filling them out historically. I sometimes think in our humanities study, an important thing to do is fill out a lot of things John Paul said from history and literature. And if you want to fill out this passage from Letter to Women a little bit, Euripides is a great place to start.